Good morning. We're going to go ahead and start with this session. My name is Aimee Bartlett. I am the Hazard Mitigation Bureau Chief within the Recovery Division of the Iowa Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Joining me today is Katie Waters, the Public Assistance Bureau Chief within the Recovery Division. We're going to discuss preliminary damage assessments and how the disaster recovery process works here in the state of Iowa. We'll cover topics such as state recovery programs, federal recovery programs, the local and state assessment process, and then we'll also discuss a few lessons learned and provide some resources for future assessments that may take place. And we'll ask that you hold your questions to the end, but feel free to enter them in the chat box as we go along, and we'll kind of review that at the end of the presentation. And we'll go ahead and get started. So the first topic to cover is various state recovery programs. The first of those is the State Individual Assistance Program. This is a grant program that authorized when an emergency management coordinator requests a proclamation for the Iowa Individual Assistance Grant Program through Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management within a governor's proclamation. It is a grant that is run and administered by the Iowa Department of Human Services, and it provides up to $5,000 for households with incomes up to 200% of the federal poverty level. The federal poverty level is adjusted annually, and households can apply to DHS for grants related to home or vehicle repairs, replacement of clothing or food, and for expenses related to various recovery that they may need after a disaster event. So again, it's dependent on a governor's proclamation for the county, and it's dependent on the emergency management coordinator providing that information and making that request to our department. Potential applicants or households have 45 days from the date of proclamation to submit a claim to DHS. There is a potential for extensions on that if circumstances require. The governor's proclamation for state individual assistance also activates the Iowa Disaster Case Management Program, also administered through the Iowa Department of Human Services. It includes services for eligible households within the county to develop and implement a disaster recovery plan. So it's not financial assistance to the household, but it is a planning resource and a central point of contact for households within the county to determine if there are unmet needs for that household and what additional resources may be available. The staff provide guidance and referrals to households for obtaining those available services, and they can also advocate for additional resources from various providers to address different needs that households may be experiencing to prevent, mitigate, or overcome disaster-related hardship, injury, and adverse conditions. So again, this is an automatic when the State Individual Assistance Program is activated within the Governor's Proclamation of Disaster Emergency, and the Iowa Individual Assistance Grant Program is activated. So they're both administered by Department of Human Services, and currently Department of Human Services contracts with the community action agencies. So they are the central point of contact for the recovery plans for households. Shifting gears a little bit, the next program is the State Contingent Fund. So the treasurer of the state of Iowa maintains a contingent fund for use by the Iowa Executive Council. The contingent fund may be used to aid any government subdivision in an area declared by the governor to be a disaster area due to natural disasters. Funds dispersed under the program may be expended for purposes of paying necessary expenses to avert or lessen the impact of potential and actual disasters as proclaimed by the governor. So this program can be activated through our department, whether it's a federal declared or a state declared natural disaster. And typical expenses or project requests are for for recovery aspects that are not covered under a federal program because it's not declared, or if they are ineligible for any other federal assistance. The contingent funds are provided in the form of an interest-free loan that must be repaid within 20 years, and the aggregate total of loans every state fiscal year shall not exceed $1 million. So our office can accept and review applications for a number of entities by fiscal year not to exceed $1 million. So for example, I think for this year we have maybe 4 or 5 different jurisdictions that have reached out and are discussing this potential for a contingent fund, and we're managing that, all of those applications combined up to $1 million for this fiscal year. It does reset at the beginning of the next fiscal year, so we can address additional applications next year. Okay, we'll shift over to a few of the federal programs. Hopefully you're a little bit familiar with these, but we'll get into some different aspects on these programs. So the first one is the FEMA Public Assistance Program. It provides assistance to local, state, and tribal governments and certain private nonprofits to remove debris, provide emergency protective measures, and restore equipment, buildings, and other infrastructure damaged by a disaster. The program is activated by a federal disaster declaration and must be supported with local assessment and state verification. FEMA's Individual Assistance Program provides assistance to support the recovery of disaster survivors who have uninsured or underinsured necessary expenses and serious needs. Assistance under the program can include grants to help repair or replace damage to primary residences, temporary rental assistance, lodging expense reimbursement. Those are all direct financial assistance to the household. FEMA also has another category of assistance under this program identified as other needs assistance. This is also financial assistance to the household for necessary expenses and serious needs such as medical, dental, funeral, and burial expenses, essential household items, child care, fuel for primary heat source, and vehicle damage. Depending on the severity and the magnitude of the event, there are non-financial assistance that can be made available to households as well. Those include items such as direct temporary housing, disaster unemployment assistance, disaster legal services, crisis counseling, and FEMA can also support the state in their disaster case management activities. The third disaster recovery program is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. It provides grants to local, state, and tribal governments for long-term hazard mitigation projects. The purpose of the program is to reduce the loss of life and property in future disasters. This is typically automatically authorized under a federal declaration that has permanent repairs for public assistance. The funding is made available statewide. It is not contingent on declared counties. And it is a capped amount of funding as well, but it can be used to support some of the repair or recovery efforts under public assistance the programs can be joined together if need be. And then the last one we'll talk about is the community disaster loan. This is a program under FEMA that provides operational funding to assist local governments that have incurred a significant loss in revenue due to a major disaster that has or will adversely affect their ability to provide essential municipal services. So this becomes available to the state to request upon a federal disaster declaration, but it does require a separate activation request based on the needs of the communities within the disaster area. If requested and activated, our office, Homeland Security, works closely with FEMA to deploy financial personnel to the various communities to discuss and analyze the impacts of the disaster and determine which potential applicants meet the requirements of the program. It is a loan, but in our experience recently, many of those loans can be forgiven after a number of years, and that is the case within the state of Iowa for recent disaster declarations. So that's a quick recap of some of the state and federal recovery programs. I will shift over to Katie to discuss the assessments and declaration process.
Okay. So the next portion of this presentation discusses pretty much the process. What's that? Okay, it discusses the process in order to get to the point in which we're evaluating which programs and assistance would be available based off of the impacts at the local and state level. So the preliminary damage assessment, otherwise known as the PDA, is used to determine the impact and magnitude of damage and the resulting unmet needs of individuals, businesses, the public sector, and the community as a whole. So Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management uses this information to evaluate the local and state capability to respond, and we use the information to determine the assistance and programs, state or federal, that are available and required in order to meet the need. The state has adopted a phased approach to developing a complete PDA, or preliminary damage assessment. The results of each phase can determine the need to commence the next phase, and they're broken out by the first step being the local damage assessment, the second being state verification, and the third, the federal validation. The next couple slides will go into those in more depth. The information that's collected within this process is used by the state as the basis for the governor's request for a Stafford Act declaration, and by FEMA to document the recommendation made to the president in response to the governor's request. Okay. So that first phase is the local damage assessment. By Iowa Admin Code, the local emergency management coordinator is established as the responsible entity for coordination and collection of damage assessment and impact statement information. Not every incident will require detailed information beyond what is available through situational awareness. However, if the county emergency management coordinator determines supplemental recovery funding assistance is necessary, the county emergency management coordinator can coordinate damage reporting within the state. So the normal process would be typically within 72 hours of the disaster occurring, the county emergency management coordinator develops an initial damage report. The initial damage report is really bare bones and is intended to provide an overview estimation of the type and amount of damage within areas within the jurisdiction that sustained damage. This report is then provided through a situational report or an event entry in WebEOC, or via the state's damage collection tool, the collector. We then monitor, HSEMD, monitor WebEOC and the collector tools and any other way that it tends to come in through emails to the duty officer email box. And we gather this information to determine the impact to homes and public infrastructure. So based on the county and statewide initial damage reports, the Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, specifically the Recovery Division, will identify the affected areas that will require a local damage assessment. When the need for the local damage assessment is identified, the County Emergency Management Coordinator is notified of this need, and we ask for confirmation that the county intends to pursue state or federal assistance. At that point in time, Iowa Homeland Security will establish a deadline in which we need to receive the local damage assessment information. In order to complete the local damage assessment, we do realize that in some instances, the counties don't necessarily have their PDA teams developed or built, so we do entertain requests for programmatic or technical subject matter experts in order to assist in performing the local damage assessments. It is important to remember that expedient, accurate damage assessments are built on a foundation of information gathered at the local level. A common mistake made in the damage assessment process is the rushing of local assessments. This is an error that can prolong verification and validation phases and slow the delivery of assistance. So the next phase would be the state verification. In accordance with 44 CFR, or Code of Federal Regulations, the state is required to verify the local damage assessment information prior to requesting federal support. So ideally, the local damage assessment would be verified remotely. This is dependent on the amount of information and the quality of the local damage assessment. If we're lacking information, or if there are, I guess, some areas in which red flags are raised that we feel like FEMA would question the damage estimates or the impacts to an area, we may require a follow-up or an in-person site visit depending on the level of information that's actually provided in the local damage assessment. We will focus, and when I say we, I mean Iowa Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, we will focus on verifying areas with concentrated or large damage impacts first to achieve the per capita indicators and to establish the impact to individuals. We will also develop impact statements in conjunction with the County Emergency Management Coordinators during the state verification phase. The third phase of the preliminary damage assessment would be the FEMA validation. If the state's review of the local damage assessment results in a determination that criteria has been met to justify either an emergency or a major disaster declaration, joint preliminary damage assessment will be requested of FEMA. The request for a joint PDA will include the counties to be assessed and a summary of the information that the state verified off of the local damage assessment. And we will provide this to FEMA. Again, FEMA can do the joint PDA virtually. However, it may be deemed necessary for the FEMA and the state to come out and do follow-up or in-person visits, depending on the level of information that's included within the local damage assessment. Joint FEMA state PDAs are intended to validate information. Those joint PDAs are not intended to find damage. So the identification of damage should have already been accomplished during the local damage assessment phase. The state is responsible for coordinating with local county emergency management to ensure they are prepared to discuss damage and guide field teams to residences, businesses, and/or damaged infrastructure to conduct a site visit. Generally, joint PDA teams ask to start with the most heavily damaged homes and infrastructure, and then we work our way down, taking into account geography and travel time. When joint PDAs are required to validate damage for the public assistance program, local county emergency management coordinators will need to schedule time with applicants to discuss damage and review supporting documentation for the site visit. So this slide covers a couple of the, I guess, key lessons learned that we've learned over the past 12, 13 years, and most recently, what's been working for us in regards to the content of the presidential request letter. The information that's been going into the governor's presidential request letter contains items like GIS analysis of the impact area. The local damage reports will actually scour social media, news reports, as well as inputs into WebEOC. We include impacts such as the duration of response activities, the duration of the event, prolonged damage, recent disasters, mitigation activities that have occurred, and compounding cascading damages. We also do take information out of WebEOC from the mission tasks, and we also gather information from private nonprofit partners in regards to their response and donation activities. So what's of note here when we're talking about the type of information that we're including within the presidential request letter, we do take a look at the situational reports uploaded within WebEOC. However, the bulk of this analysis is us mining for this information out of media and social media reports. It would be extremely helpful in future disasters if you could provide additional information that would show or depict the impact to your county, because we do need to get the presidential request letter isn't dependent on the numbers alone. So it's not just dependent on meeting those per capita thresholds or the number of homes that were major destroyed. It also depends on the impact. So we really need good impact statements that go into that letter. So just something to consider in the future. It could help us, we've been doing these presidential request letters quickly after events recently. It is a lot of pressure, and we realize it's a lot of pressure at the local level. Having to mine for this information does take significant time. So if you are aware of significant issues within your county, just make sure to make WebEOC entries so that it's easy for us to identify and include. And then something else that we've learned recently, I'd say the last 2 years, we've really been taking advantage of these virtual assessments, which really has only become available to us in the last 2 years, mainly because of FEMA's lack of personnel, to be honest. They don't have enough people to deploy to every event to do these joint PDAs. So they're entertaining these virtual assessments more often. The documentation to successfully conduct a virtual assessment is likely higher than what you would have to provide in an instance where you have on-site PDAs, because then you've got FEMA and the state there and the county, and you can just pull whatever you need for them to see while they're sitting there. However, in order to do these virtual assessments, you have to gather all the documentation and get it up to us in order to validate it and send it up for the verification with FEMA. However, what this does do, for those that have really been involved in this process for, going back 12 years, 10 years, we used to do these 3 phases all in person. So you would have the local damage assessment. However, typically the local damage assessment would be supported by Iowa Homeland Security staff. So we'd actually come out and assist you in performing your PDA. So that's the first time we'd come and visit. And then once we got done with the local damage assessment and it was submitted up, then we started the state damage assessment. And just because our staff was there during the local damage assessment didn't relieve us of our responsibility of doing it again. So we were there again for the state verification. And once we did the state piece, we then requested the joint PDA, and then FEMA came out again. So we were in your county 3 times over a 30-day period of time, which is a huge burden when you're still in a response mode. So these virtual assessments have really alleviated that. We've had a lot of success with it. We've had instances in which we haven't even had to go out for an on-site visit at all. So we made it through all phases without state or FEMA employees having to go out to the field. So it is something we're wanting to continue to build on and develop. So that's something to consider. Also of note would be the timeline for add-ons and appeals. So the timelines for add-ons and appeals are really established the moment we receive a declaration. So that starts the clock for both requesting add-ons and for appealing any counties that may have been denied in the original request or subsequent request. So the other challenge with this is when we do, like for example, with the expedited declaration request that we've been doing recently, typically in that short of a period of time, we only include the counties that we have the most information for. So because, you know, we might have a week in order to submit it. And if we're not able to verify that we're meeting thresholds and we're not able to get the impact statements for, say, 10 additional counties that may have experienced impacts, we just don't know the extent. The first declaration request may come in without the 10 included. What ends up happening is the moment we get a declaration, we're then on a clock in order to get those other 10 counties added. So that's just something else to consider as you're preparing your local damage assessment information and, you know, really the completeness of that information, because it does affect, you know, future timeframes if you're not including the initial designation of counties. And then in addition, the level of information gathered during the damage assessments, I know everybody hates to hear, you know, project level damage assessments or project ready damage assessments. And that's really not what we're looking for. However, I would encourage you to continue on with your damage assessment process even when we're done at the state and federal level for the purpose of requesting the declaration, because that damage assessment information can really be utilized to, I guess, pre-position the jurisdictions within your county for the next steps following a declaration. That information that comes from the PDA is really important when it comes to budgeting. Also really important for determining workload and staffing projections at the state and FEMA levels, as well as, you know, getting ahead of the game in regards to the public assistance project formulation. So just to give you some examples of how that information can be used that you may not think the PDA information is being used. So like back in the 2019 flood event, there was an obvious unmet need in regards to federal assistance. It was really hard to identify what that unmet need was because we did a lower level of the damage assessment at the time we did the declaration request, because we did an expedited declaration request for that event. So we knew there was an unmet need, we knew it was out there, we just didn't know how big it was. So then you started seeing the flood recovery fund come available through the Flood Mitigation Board. Those I guess the dollar estimates that were provided to the governor's office in order to determine how much state funding was going to be needed to meet that unmet need, those come from damage assessments because it's the earliest information available. And so you noticed additional allocations to that fund as additional information became available. Same type of scenario would be for like the COVID event. The use of the CARES fund that came available through the local government relief fund, or recently for the CARES funds for the non-federal share match to the FEMA Public Assistance Program. The estimates for the amount of money that was going to be put aside through the CARES funds are generated from the PDA information that we have. Unfortunately, for the COVID event, because we just got an automatic declaration because of the public health emergency, we didn't have any PDA information. So it took us some time to get to a point in which we could actually provide those estimates as to what we would need in CARES funding, because we needed to really get those estimates into our tracking systems in order to determine, what was the need, what types of activities were occurring at the local level that either the FEMA PA program wasn't going to fund, or IDPH wasn't going to have CARES funding, or HHS funding. So really, I think the damage assessment information, it's not just used for Stafford Act declarations, is what I'm trying to say here. It's used for a whole multitude of things, and the more information you have and the more information you share, the more you'll benefit. Okay, and then this slide here just provides some quick resource links. And these, you actually have to have an ArcGIS account in order to access. Most of the county coordinators do at this point because they've been utilizing the collector tool. If you do not have access to these, go ahead and just send myself or Aimee an email. Our contact information will be on the next slide. And we can actually just pull this information down for you and send it to you. But much of the content of this presentation is actually taken out of the preliminary damage assessment standard operating procedure. And there is actually addendums or appendices to the SOP that are called field guides. And they're really like real short handbooks that can be taken into the field by your PDA teams, and there's two of them, one for public assistance and one for individual assistance. The walkthrough of the state and federal programs can also be found within the SOP, and it also describes the activating mechanism to turn on the different programs. Next would be also through the ArcGIS site, we do have our thresholds for the public assistance program identified. Those are changed out as they are updated on an annual basis. And there's also a pretty thorough explanation as to the disaster declaration process in there as well. So here are your contacts for the different programs. As Aimee had briefed, we do not, Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management does not manage the state IA or case management programs. However, you can reach out to Aimee, and she can help coordinate and answer questions. And then the state contingent fund, that's actually handled out of our Disaster Grants and Admin Bureau, Bonnie Reeder. Again, Aimee here, she'd be your point of contact for FEMA individual assistance. I'm your contact for public assistance. See, Aimee's really important because here she is again. She'll be your point of contact for the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program. So this is more than just the HMGB or the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that she briefed today. She covers all the rest of the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program that aren't necessarily related to disaster declarations. And then next we have Bonnie for the FEMA Community Disaster Loan. So I think that concludes the presentation, so we'll go ahead and go to questions. I'm going to go ahead and read the questions that we've got in the Q&A section. First would be from Thomas Creighton, where do we get the information on the contingent fund? Thomas, if you actually go to that preliminary damage assessment standard operating procedure, you'll actually find the information on the contingent fund. In addition,
I was just going to say there is a, so with the, for example, with the applicants that we're working with, typically what happens with the state contingent fund is we get word, or our office gets word, that there's a local community that has an unmet need because something was ineligible for FEMA funding, or it was a local disaster, therefore there are no federal funds available, and so the community sometimes reaches out to us, sometimes it's the county coordinators that reach out to us, and then we kind of initiate that application process. So it's kind of a financial analysis of what the scope of work is for that unmet need, what disaster was it related to, and then the financial information about it before we put it forward to the state executive council to review. As Katie said, the information's in the SOP, but if you have specific questions or want to see an example, we have some of that information available from recent applications, and we're always here to assist to walk those communities and you through that process. So Philip asked, how many damaged farms, homes, businesses, photos should I send? How should I package or format the information, and should public infrastructure come first? That's actually a very good question. And so some of you experienced this year, especially for those that were potential add-ons for individual systems, or appealing it, or in instances where we look for an SBA declaration or a Small Business Administration declaration, which we didn't get into the specifics of that in this presentation. But so typically with photos, when we're doing a virtual assessment and it's on homes and businesses, so I would throw, we can have photos of farms and outbuildings and infrastructure within the farm provided, but unless it is the primary residence, the structure itself isn't going to count on the assessment with FEMA. So you want to make sure that your photos are either the primary residence or the primary business structure. If we're talking the Small Business Administration, where we can include residential and business damage impacts. You want to make sure you've got the primary of either one of those, and that you are able to show the extent of the damage. So whether that means, you're just taking a photo from the front of the home showing the roof is gone, or if you're taking a close-up photo of a few corners of the structure to show that it's shifted on its foundation. Typically, we're getting a handful by structure just to show the different components of that damage. So I'd recommend at least a couple of photos from a couple of different angles, just so we can, see, the front of the structure, if that's where the damage is, or if the damage is in the back and you have permission to go on that property and take that photo, that you're just able to show that extensive damage. And if there's any questions when photos come in, we'll be sure to reach back out or come out and assist with getting some more detailed photos. The format or package, whatever format that photo or that information comes in at. Some are able to do it with a PDF. Some do it with a JPEG format. We just need to be able to know what address we're looking at. Or what structure we're looking at. So if you have if you're just numbering your photos 1 through 5, we need to know, what's the address for photo number 1. Some choose to rename the photos based on the street address. That works well too. And then we're just providing those to FEMA kind of on a Google Drive type sharing network. So format, it shouldn't really be a major issue there. And then should public infrastructure come first? That's kind of I would say for assessment-wise, in order for Katie to include the county and meet that threshold within the declaration, she would probably want those up front, although she does have an opportunity to do add-ons later. And then for individual assistance, recently we have seen FEMA, if they can make an outright declaration for a county based on the severity of the impact, they will declare that county or those couple of counties, and then they will defer a determination on other counties and give us an opportunity to provide some additional information. So for example, with this year's event, FEMA came out and did a kind of a walkthrough in Lynn County. So they were able to declare Lynn County up front, but they chose not to make a decision at that time on the other counties until we were able to kind of collect some of that additional information. So, it's kind of hard to say which one should come first, but I would say public assistance is a little bit more of a priority because they're usually a yes or no, on that initial federal declaration. And we prefer not to have to appeal counties if we don't have to. But we would have that discussion with you kind of ongoing, look at the data you have, look if it makes sense to include on the initial declaration or if we should just wait and do an add-on. And then sometimes there's a lot of political pressure on that too, so you'll kind of have to manage that on your end as well as we'll manage it on ours. So there's some different factors that go in there, but we'll work through that as we start developing the actual disaster declaration.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, if you go back to what really initiates the PDA phases, it's that initial damage report, that situational awareness, just showing, quick, dirty impacts to, quick numbers of homes, maybe where you think you're at PA estimate-wise, so that when we get that information, we can actually help you prioritize. So, if it comes in and say the statewide threshold is, just over 4.5 million, if we only get 3 counties reporting and it's under 2 million, we'll tell you at that point in time, you don't need to go any further in gathering local damage assessment information because we're nowhere close to the threshold. But if, say, we end up with 10 to 20 counties and we're at $20 million with just the initial damage reports, we will come back to you and say, all right, now we need you to do your local damage assessment because we're moving forward. We're likely going to be requesting either state or federal programs to be turned on. Same would go for IA. If you only report minor damage to 2 homes, like Aimee will likely say, don't bother going forward with the local damage assessment in your county for IA because it doesn't look like you've got enough in order to even include it. So, so anyway, we can help you prioritize, and we will, once we've determined that we're moving on to that local damage assessment phase, both IA and PA, we have deadlines we have to meet in order to get the declaration in. I think it's within 30 days of the end of the incident. So we will establish those deadlines and help you prioritize what we need. Okay.
So I think
that answers that question. So then, Rebecca, your question is there going to be a way in the future for FEMA to access the information in the Collector app? FEMA actually already has access to the Collector app when we do our damage assessments. I think your question is more pertinent to the public assistance program and post-declaration. So currently, the damage assessment staff that FEMA sends up or is supporting virtually, they're not the same staff that actually manage the programs. And so the damage assessment information really isn't it doesn't flow naturally from damage assessment to program administration, although it should. So those individuals, when they start to formulate your projects, they typically do not get into the collector app, even though they do have access to it and can be granted access to it. They don't do that. So really what we've been training on and briefing is you all have access to the information you're putting into collector. My guidance would be to you to pull all that data back out and distribute it back to the jurisdiction so that they've got essentially a packet that's ready that they can hand off to FEMA when they come out to do the project formulation step, and they don't have to recreate anything that they've already done. They're just handing it off. So that would be my guidance.
So Chance, is there a way we can work towards slowing down the damage assessment process back to the previous timeline? We are still in a life safety mode on the trade show event. When damage assessment data was being requested, our experience is that virtual assessments and lack of FEMA joint PDA are a detriment to the locals. The process is too fast and relying too much on local assets. Yes, we've discussed this recently, both last year and maybe even more so this year. You know, our office has specific deadlines. We have direction from our governor's office on what that process and that timeline looks like. And so we are trying to manage both the expectation from the governor's office and be able to provide a good level of assistance to you and your local representatives in that damage assessment process. I would say that the federal timelines have not changed, but there has been a precedent set and an expectation that when there is a major event, we have some declaration information compiled, put together, and turned around for the governor's office within a much shorter timeline than what maybe would have happened prior to 2019. So we are trying our best to develop those processes and programs and tools to assist local governments in their damage assessment. The virtual process, I think, was unique this year in particular, partly because of the COVID event. Typically, I think even last year, at least for individual assistance, and I think it was the same with public assistance, they did do some virtually to make the initial declaration, but then add-ons or additional validations, being FEMA, since they had the staff here in the state, they did go out and do actual physical assessments for add-ons or additional category of work add-ons, whatever it may be. So it was a unique experience this year because of the COVID. We don't typically see FEMA doing everything virtually, but I wouldn't be surprised if this, again, sets the stage for future disaster declarations and assessment reviews to do as much virtually as possible. But I'd also like to say, you know, our staff is here to help you as much as we can. You know, if we need to send a live person out there to assist with photos or gathering documentation, we will try to make that work as much as possible. In the COVID situation, in a normal year, I think our staff is out there multiple days in a row trying to assist and gather that information. FEMA may not be present, but I think our staff is still, that's kind of our number one priority, is to assist and make sure that we're able to help you collect that information as much as possible. So we understand the timelines are quite tight, that a lot of folks are still in that response mode. That's something we've talked about internally, but a lot of times those timelines are out of our control as well, because again, that expectation has been set and the direction has been given by the governor's office to move as quickly as possible on that.
Yeah, I think the one point I would like to make, Chance, is the FEMA joint PDAs are still occurring. There isn't a lack of those occurring when we're requesting the declaration. That's still happening. They're just not on site. And I suppose I do want to just say, you know, even if FEMA staff is on site, they're not looking for your damage or coming up with your supporting documentation for you. They're simply on site to, you know, yep, the bridge has been washed out, and then they drive off and go to the next site. Like, they're not, I guess, they're not alleviating any local burden by being on site. So that's just the point I want to make. And again, to your next question, Phil, it says, this will take many hours to do. How much should I do? I'm doing response life safety also. Yep, so again, we're focused on your hardest hit, most heavily damaged areas and infrastructure. So that's what you should focus on. There actually, if you refer back to the field guides attached to the PDA SOP, it gives you some priorities and some ways to, you know, this is what I should focus on. We're not asking you to do 100% of documentation for your PDAs. We're not asking you to drive by every single home. We're not asking you to drive by every building that was damaged and take 5 photos per building. That's not the request. We're asking for a sampling of the supporting documentation to match the estimates that are being provided. So the documentation piece is outlined within the PDA field guide, and also what you should be looking at right away. What are your priorities for gathering estimates right away? So those tools are available. Please take advantage of them.
Is the GIS portal open to local, like, communities?
If they ask for access, yeah.
Yeah, so, sorry, we were just, so I think it's a good opportunity to kind of have that discussion with some of your local governments and some of their representatives. They may have some capacity, although they're still doing those response activities just like you are, but they may have some capacity to collect some of that information and support of the county. So just keep that in mind too. There are some counties that have developed those assessment teams within their local governments to help collect that information. And they can request and report into the GIS portal as well. You know, that it may just depend on how much oversight or consideration you want to give to that type of process, but that may be an option as well, so that it's not, you know, one person such as yourself in your county. You may be able to kind of have that team mentality when it's applicable. And so Thomas, is the info in the Iowa legal aid for individuals tied to a FEMA declaration for IA? Well, I think Iowa legal aid, I don't know as much about that process, but if it's a state organization that's funded after a disaster, typically it wouldn't require a FEMA declaration for individual assistance. So what the FEMA declaration could do for an organization like that is to provide disaster-specific legal services, and they have their own legal team that they can stand up to assist with specific situations. I know in 2019, I think they stood up because there were so many residences impacted with, you know, mortgage issues, foreclosure issues, different things like that. But I think Iowa legal aid is more of a state program and is not dependent on FEMA, on a FEMA declaration, but I'll confirm that, and just, if my answer is different, I will let everybody know. But I'm not as familiar with the Iowa legal aid as and what turns that on.
That's it?
So I think that's all we have so far.
Yep, so that answers all the questions that were in the Q&A. We can hang on until our 10 o'clock is up, so if anybody wanted to hang on and submit some additional questions, we'll be here. But otherwise, that concludes our presentation. Thank you.